Here we are, talking about coaching. I'm Yannick. I'm here with Sirvash, my trusted podcast partner. Hey, Sirvash, how you doing?
Hey guys, yeah, I'm great. Great.
We're missing Nikki today. She can't be with us, so we're holding down the fort, and we're planning a special session today, since we're celebrating the coaching lab. As you know, we never promote really anything here. And I don't really want to go into much promotion. I really want to make this as useful as possible. But you can see I'm in my lab coat. I'm in my digital lab. If you can see it, if you're listening to this and you want to see it, go hop over on Facebook or YouTube. But yes, this week we're launching the next evolution of it. So I figured let's celebrate that in some way and in some useful way. So the question that well, we don't get asked specifically, but that is often in the room, is what does coaching actually look like once we've finished our training program? Once we're out of the theory. I mean, the theory informs us, but so many times, and I've seen that in the coaching lab, day in and day out, well, month in and month out, is that coaches do something, and often you think, wait a second, that's not what you're supposed to do as a coach. So that's what I want to discuss today. Okay, Sirvash, I wonder if you have some initial thoughts on this while I get this out there so we can get a couple of more people involved.
Yeah. So what does coaching look like? Well, first of all, before we dive in, I love the coaching lab. I've, been there from the beginning. It's super valuable. And yeah, the question is also a great question because, I've been coaching now 6.5 years professionally, like full time. And I've asked myself that question a lot of times because I think my very first coach wasn't really a proper coach. He was more like a motivational guy and more American style, like, pumping me up. And it had some benefits, right? Like it helped me believe more in myself, right? And it motivated me to go into action. But I've asked myself that question a lot of times because I ask myself that question about myself, my own work, and then also sometimes from working with other coaches or observing other coaches, right? And interestingly, it's I think after a year or a year and a half of me being a coach, I actually did my first coaching diploma, and that's when I was like, oh wow, so this is coaching. Right? So it's a little bit like, imagine you've been learning like kickboxing and you learn how to, throw some punches, but then you actually join like a real boxing school. And then you're like, whoa, this is boxing. This is clean boxing, right? And that's for me coaching. Coaching is like, pure coaching for me is very similar to boxing, right? And, there's no elbows involved. There's no kicks involved. There's no headbutting, right? But it's very powerful. It's very effective, and there's other tools and techniques that people like to use. There's MMA fighting has become very popular. Jiu-jitsu, you have so many different martial arts. But for me, like coaching is like pure boxing. and that's when I experienced it, I was like, wow, you know what, this is what I want to go deeper into. I can see how amazing this is, and I think a lot of people don't really, unless they've really gone through a program that teaches that, a lot of people I think don't really know what pure coaching is or what coaching looks like.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? Pure boxing, that exists because there's a very specific set of rules of what's allowed and what's not allowed. And it's really, I don't think that's possible for coaching. I mean, the professional bodies, AC, ICF, EMCC, a couple of other smaller bodies around, but there's competency frameworks, guidelines on what to do, how to behave, what's ethical, what's right and wrong, what makes a good coach. but it's really difficult to really define. And even within something, as well, clear. I'm hesitating to say clear as the ICF framework, but something as detailed as the ICF framework, with how a session runs, what are the markers for success at different levels of coaching mastery. I mean, they put a lot of work into what coaching is and what isn't coaching, and on those markers, you can pass or fail your ICF credentials. So, but it's still, I mean, if you watch, I mean, I've seen coaches in the ICF coaches, PCC, MCC in the coaching lab, and they all had very different styles. And I can see certain things that they all do, but still there's such a broad range within it. And even as an ICF coach, it's absolutely okay hey, I'm going to take my coaching hat off for a moment. If I were to step into a mentoring role and just kind of switch hats for a bit. And I find that in reality, coaches do that more and more. And I got a feeling at some point that the longer somebody coaches, the more they're willing to put something into the room, on the table, maybe make a suggestion. And that I found really interesting, because some at master level, they really don't do that anymore ever, because they really developed this mastery of trusting the resources of the client. But it seems that the majority of coaches bring in this mentoring, consulting, teaching, sharing information element of coaching. And then it becomes really, really gray.
Yeah, and I think, I don't think necessarily it's a bad thing, right? But it's just that I think sometimes as people get exposed to different ways of doing things, it's a bit like this, right? Like someone get exposed to Muay Thai and then like, you know what, actually I like this. I like to use my knees. I like to use my elbows, or kickboxing. And I think sometimes like people just see like, hey, you know what, boxing is great, but I'm gonna learn other martial arts.
Well, it's very effective to use your elbow.
Yeah, and it's a different way of doing things, right? And I think you have people that really love coaching, and they see the effectiveness of that, they see the power of that, and they like to stay there. I think often also I see, and that's also with myself, I have a bit of a teaching background, right? So before coaching, I used to do a lot of part-time teaching, right? And so I saw that, hey, I enjoy teaching. I want to slowly bring some of that into my work, right? How can I bring some of that into my work? And often, like, it's not always within the same session, but that was the question for me, is like, can I bring some of these other things that I enjoy into my work?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think it's I think that's what I see more and more, is that people that have a training background, for example, they kind of fusion that.
Yeah, well, who you are is how you coach, is what I often say, right? How you are as a person is what you're going to bring into your coaching. And coaching is such a broad umbrella term for helping practices. And, in the beginning, I was very passionate about coaching is supposed to be that thing that was introduced to me as coaching. And then I realized there's so much more out there. And I mean, first, when you kind of look outside of your training school and their reading materials and their demonstrations, it can be a bit shocking, what other people are doing and calling it coaching. And you start questioning, well, if they call that coaching, well, what do I do then? And so I've seen so many different styles now of coaching that, I'm not just that I made my peace, but I'm really embraced the range of what coaching can be. Because if somebody decides to call something coaching, then it is arguably coaching. And I had a longer conversation with Damien Goldwag, who was president of the ICF for a couple of years, a number of years ago, about professionalization of the industry. And he was very passionate about, you got to be a member of a professional body and you got to work within the competencies, because that's going to give credibility to our profession. And I totally get that. I really appreciate that we're trying to standardize coaching in some way, so that there is a credibility growing with the approach, and that maybe someday people will know what someone means when they say coaching, because that's a bit of an issue. If you say I'm a coach and somebody else says, oh yeah, I understand, yeah, then I don't think they understand. It's unlikely that somebody will understand what you mean when you say you're a coach. And so in some ways, it would be nice if there was one thing that is coaching with very clear boundaries. But on the other hand, it would take a lot of diversity away from the practice. And as you say, right, mixed martial arts became very popular for a really good reason, because it's integrative. You can be a better fighter, if you're a better martial artist, if you bring in different styles or different elements of other styles. And I think the same is true when we work with people. I'm not saying coaching necessarily, but when we work with people to support people, to help people, I think coaching is one way of doing that, at least what I understand coaching to be. But there's a lot more that we can integrate from other approaches to helping people by talking, and not just talking. There's somatic coaches, there's lots of hands-on coaches who do a lot of stuff that isn't necessarily verbal. So, I would want to celebrate the range of that. And that's what we do at the Coaching Lab, right? We celebrate the range of what coaching can be, but also take a critical stance and challenge, like, interesting. And I remember one of our coaches, one of our guests said, constantly I had the feeling that the ICF police would come and get me any moment now. But in that moment, like intuitively, it was the right thing to do, she felt, to work with this client in this way and outside of the ICF competencies. So on some level, she had this like, oh my God, they're going to get me and I'm being observed. There's like an audience and, they're going to judge me on that's not coaching and what are you doing and that's not allowed. And on the other hand, the client said, well, that was really, really helpful and I really loved it. And if that wouldn't have been there, I would have felt I would have been missing out.
Yeah. What comes up for me is I had a conversation with Nick Bolton a few years ago. He's CEO of Animas, right? A great coaching school. And in our conversation, it's about this topic. And he said something to me, right? Like that he sees coaching more as a tool, not just a title. And that's really stuck with me. And I think that's also another great way of looking at it.
A tool rather than a title.
Yeah, a tool, right? Like and like the example you gave, like sometimes in the moment you might slow down and see that, well, in this moment, what serves the client is maybe a different tool, right? And again, like this is, I think, I think once people. This is my way of thinking. I'm not saying it's good or bad, right? But I think, if people actually go through a coaching training and they have that foundation, right? Then and as they build a lot of, through practice, they build their skills and they get experience. There are moments where they can see that, maybe what can serve the client is something else in this moment. Right, but I think the problem in the industry is that half of the people that call themselves coaches are not trained. Right, you have people that actually just teach people marketing and they call themselves coaches.
Yeah, coach me through this.
Yeah, and I think the word coach is overused by people that actually are not coaches. And I think that's where kind of like the problem has happened, right, in the market as well. Like, oh, I'm a coach, I can help you with X, Y, Z. But actually they like my first coach, I love him. I love the guy, played an important role in my journey. I worked with him 3 months, called himself a coach, but he wasn't a coach. Right? And
well, who's to say? I think I know what you mean by now in the context of what we've been talking about.
Yeah. And I think sometimes it comes from that. Like you look at a football coach, right? I love sports, and some football coaches are great. They get more out of the players. They like help them tap into more of their potential. But at the same time, like sometimes you look at them and it's just they're telling players what to do. They're like, this is how I want you to play. and you need to follow this to the T. If you don't, you're on the bench.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that can work, depending on the player, but it has clear limitations. If you just because you're an excellent football player doesn't mean you're an excellent coach. It doesn't mean you're an excellent teacher. Just because you know something doesn't mean you have the skill set also to transmit that learning. I mean,
yeah.
you might need to learn communication in order to really transmit that. In order to teach, there's a skill set that you need to learn. And in order to coach, I think that's a lot more complex because it's relationship based. So you need to develop this awareness about yourself in relation to other people. And that's why I think the coaching skill set really enhances the work that we do with people. But I also think that the teaching or consulting or mentoring skill set can also enhance coaching. So, I mean, I've always seen it as an... Your otter keeps trying to join. Your AI. So occasionally it just keeps knocking on the door. I think it's sad that I didn't let it in. Anyway, to push me off track. So yeah, I think coaching at its best, working with people at its best, is an integrative practice. And however we want to frame the coaching skill set, it has huge bits to offer. I think the word of warning I always put in is that once we start teaching or mentoring or consulting, once we introduce that element into our coaching, like once you lose an elbow in a fight in boxing, I don't think you can go back. There's going to be elbows from now on. So that's why I think it's really helpful to have that kind of contract and be very careful with what elements you're introducing into your coaching, because chances are this changes the dynamics of the practice, right? Once you stepped in and rescued a client, they might expect to be rescued because that's what you did. And why wouldn't you do it again? Especially if they liked to be rescued. Some people don't like to be rescued, but depending on the situation, that's really helpful. Why wouldn't you share that piece of information? Why wouldn't you tell me how to do marketing or business or relationships or self-love or whatever else you could teach? I mean, all of a sudden you're in the expert shoes. And once you're in the expert shoes, you carry a whole lot of responsibility that this better works. And it's difficult to go back into pure coaching, if you wanted to call it like that. Maishla just said, I find there's often confusion between coach and mentor. People who are mentors often call themselves coaches. I definitely find that as well, that people who call themselves coaches are actually doing mentoring. And I had one of my third coach in quotation marks, also I think wasn't much of a coach, much more of a mentor. Also very important in my development, but like mentoring, pretty much. With some coaching elements. And that was really helpful. But I find that I think coaches are much more concerned with what they're being called and what they call themselves than clients often are. Clients just care whether you can help them.
Yeah. I think the term coach has just become really popular in the last few years. So someone saying coach instead of mentor or coach instead of teacher. You don't see people saying I'm a mindfulness teacher instead I'm a mindfulness coach. Right? And it's just, I think the term coach has become very popular. But I love what you mentioned there, right? The client usually just cares about that thing. Like, can you help me?
Yeah, a teacher is much more clear, though. People have much more of an understanding what it means to be a teacher. Although when I teach, there's a lot of coaching elements because it's helping people learn, right? And teaching is one of the ways in which we can help people learn. But when you say to people, you're a teacher, they have a much more clearer idea of what that means. And when you say to people, I'm a coach, if they're not familiar with, the common accepted frameworks for coaching, more or less accepted, depending on who you talk to and which circles you move. Coach is much more vague. So it always kind of requires an explanation. And as I said earlier, like my horror scenario is that somebody just says, "Oh yeah, cool." Who knows what they think? Who knows what kind of coach they think I am? Well, depending on how coaching had been introduced to them and by whom.
Yeah. And another trend that I'm seeing in the coaching world is that some very experienced coaches that are actually really good at coaching, they're moving away from calling themselves a coach. They're calling themselves more a trusted advisor or a mentor. And I think one of the reasons it's happening, right, is because there's such an influx of people calling themselves coaches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so now they're trying to be different and saying, "Oh, let's call myself something else."
Yeah, I think whenever a market gets kind of flooded, there's people are looking for niches, and that's that leads to a lot of diversity, which is in many ways good. And that's also what I really like about the coaching lab. There's so many different styles and approaches coming together, and so many people really learn something from somebody who does things radically differently to them. At the same time, I'm also, I think yesterday, I think, one of my team said, well, shouldn't we really niche down a lot more? Run coaching labs for positive psychology coaches or for fitness coaches or for health coaches or for executive coaches. And I guess that makes sense. But also if we were to bubble down into this is the way that this is being done. There's diversity within that, but I think we're missing out on a lot when we were to put very clear boundaries around it, right? That's why I think, to get back to the boxing example, if there weren't any other martial arts or boxers wouldn't pay attention to other martial arts, I think boxing wouldn't have evolved. I think maybe boxing should evolve. I don't know. It's a beautiful discipline in its pure form, but I understand why the popular attention, like the most of the attention, is now with mixed martial arts rather than with boxing so much. I think there's a reason why it grew so much, because it is integrative, and that clearly strikes a chord with people. And I think the same is true for coaching, right? I think that integrative practice, that looking and being inspired by a certain technique or an intervention, by packing our toolboxes and our backpacks with lots of different elements of different styles. In that way, it'll become the new mixed martial art, so to speak. And maybe in its purest form, I'm sure it will always exist, if there is such a thing as a pure form. I think with some approaches there is, solution-focused, for example, it feels a lot more pure than other approaches are possible. Right? GROW coaching, behavioral performance coaching, using the GROW model, that can be done in a pretty pure form. These pure forms, right? These structured forms, they will be done by AI pretty soon, I reckon. But that's another topic. We just recorded a podcast a couple of weeks ago on that. But yeah, I think my point is that I don't think it's helpful for our clients if we were to stick to a very well-defined structure and framework of what coaching is. And so that's why it makes perfect sense to me that out in the real world, people branch out of their coaching schools and approaches and theories and philosophies. And that's probably a good thing, if it's done ethically.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think one of the things is that I think you made a point there around the niche, right? And personally, I think the best way to stand out, and that's I think one of the reasons people niche is, right, to stand out, to be different in this big crowd, is to just become great at what you do, right? And actually just go really deep into your learning and your skill development. And then, of course, I do think sometimes it's valuable to learn different modalities, right? But within coaching, there's so much. There's so much there. You can go really deep into positive psychology for years, right? And within that itself, you can go really deep and there's a wealth of knowledge, right? But then you can go, for example, learn about the neuroscience of coaching, right? And I think one of the things is that, see, again, like there's a trend now is like, there's coaches around, like, again, nothing is good or bad, but it's like coaches are learning how to work with trauma. I don't know what they call it, trauma-informed coaches or something, right? But, you don't need to necessarily go there. You don't need to now, like, as a coach, become, trained like a therapist. If that's something that really excites you, okay, great, right? But it's not, I don't think you have to go, it's almost like, when you think about, you can go horizontal and you can go vertical. And horizontal for me is like, okay, well, let me actually learn more about, how to teach things or how to consult and bring that into my work. And again, if that comes naturally or you have a track record, it might be really useful. But I think a lot of coaches do it for the wrong reasons. And what's, I think, a lot more, especially for coaches that love coaching, it's a lot better is to go deeper, right? Go really deep into one thing, for example, positive psychology, and then maybe branch out. But instead of branching out to a whole different thing, like consulting or teaching, go to neuroscience, right? And that makes you stand out, because I think, like, the thing is, most coaches really just, they don't really go deep in terms of developing their skill sets. And they're trying to stand out through marketing or through different ways, different strategies. But I think what they're missing is, and I love this book by Cal Newport, it's called So Good They Can't Ignore You. Right? It's like becoming masterful, not as a way of like competition, or like I'm the best, but it's becoming your best. And you will stand out. You will stand out.
Yeah, and it's a really good point, right? And definitely my bias is coming in there, because I'm quite a big picture person. I naturally take a step back and I naturally gravitate towards integration and balance rather than going really into depth on one specific thing. So branching out is a good metaphor, the language in there, just because, some coaches climb one tree to the top, and then that's the masterful in that more puristic approach. I think the foundation of the forest is what really drew me in. And so I do think that coaching is inevitably integrative, that, depending on the tree could be very wide and the tree could span across many other trees. It's difficult sometimes to tell one tree apart from its surroundings. So it's always connected. But I think there's something to it. And I definitely don't want to knock that going into depth on your approach and really becoming masterful within that particular framework is a good thing. It's a very, very valuable thing. That's why, I don't want to knock behavioral grow coaching, like performance coaching using the grow model. It's very, very effective. For me, it has clear limitations, obviously, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Probably it can sound like limitations is a bad thing because, your approach is limited, but I mean, every approach is limited. Every approach has boundaries of some sort. So I think if you get trained up and really develop masterful coaching and masterful skills in a very well-defined area, then do that and advertise that and contract that and agree on that. And if a limit is reached, then they work with someone else. And that's perfectly fine, right? It can actually be much better. But like, there is so much to learn. And I think pausing to question your approach or your bubble or your framework or your particular tree, and having an awareness of what else exists out there, you can consciously say, no, I'll stick to this. This is really valuable. But I think it's important that occasionally, at least, we step back and we look around and we see what else is out there, and I guess that's why I love the lab so much, because, it allowed me an insight into so many different ways of thinking about coaching. And sometimes I sit there and I'm like, well, that's obviously a bad question. How could they do this, or how could they not do this in this moment? And then it has tremendous effect, and I'm like, did not see that coming. I thought that would not do anything, this intervention, or, or I ask the client afterwards, it's like, hey, how did you experience that? What did that do for you, if anything? And they said, wow, this just changed the whole session. This is really the question that opened everything up. And I'm like, but that was a bad question, but it's not a bad question if it opened everything up for the client. So I'm like, okay, all right, okay, yeah. That's the kind of things you learn. And I think that's important.
Yeah. I like what you're saying, and I think again, there's not one way, and that's a beautiful thing, that there is not one way of doing things, right? I remember, doing the supervision diploma, and we get exposed to so many different ways of coaching in a short period, and I think it's so rich, right? And I know you've studied different modalities, right? You've gone deep into positive psychology, existential coaching. Well, what has your experience been in? Because I don't think, knowing you haven't just like gone surface level and then like dipped into the other one. You did kind of go deep into it, but then you like, let me explore another one. How was that? How did that benefit your coaching journey and you as a coach?
Yeah, I mean, massively. I'm generally not a person, while I do like the integration and I do look towards other approaches, other lenses, it's very rare that something is just scratched on the surface and then I move on. I do, as you mentioned that earlier, right? There are a lot of coaches who do like an evening here, or a CPD 2 hours here, or then a weekend and then a weekend and then a weekend, but then they never really get into the depth or practice it with clients for a couple of weeks or at least a couple of sessions, reflect on it, refine it. So I think that's just naturally my character, that I like to go into depth on things. But yeah, I both crave it, and also, I mean, how has it benefited me? I don't even know where to begin, right? Positive psychology and existentialism, they, on the surface, they seem to be so far apart. They seem to be at such opposite ends of the spectrum. And I guess that's what drew me there, because I felt positive psychology, there was a clear limit to what it can do. And we've seen that in the lab as well. There was a session with a positive psychology coach that just didn't really go anywhere. It didn't seem to gel or work. For me, there was a clear limit of what the approach is. And in the conversations afterwards, there was like, well, we could have gone there, or like we could have explored the pain, or we could have explored the negative emotions. We could have explored, the self-doubt. And that just wasn't part of that particular approach. So, for me, that was kind of clear early on that there's, I needed more. And that's what drew me to the existential lens. I needed an approach that would acknowledge and work with the difficulties and the challenges, the paradox, the dilemma. I wanted to have much deeper conversation. Not that you can't have very deep conversations with positive psychology coaching. Meaning, purpose, relationships, they all can be incredibly deep, very complex. But yeah, I felt sometimes it's not the right approach. And I think there's always a process of matching the approach to a client. So what it did to me, exploring more than one lens, more than these two lenses, once I was teaching so many different theoretical lenses, designed the program, the ACIC, or teaching at the masters, there's so many other lenses you really need to dig into quite some depth, because you need to open that up and have conversations with students about it. But what it did is, I lost my train of thought. It opened something up for me. I wanted to work with a lot more variety of people, because if you have a precise approach and a very well, like a kind of a pure approach, a very well defined one, then there is a particular client for whom that works. And I wanted to help, the person in front of me. And I felt if I combine different approaches, if I have different theoretical lenses, if I can switch my lens and offer something different, if I have more in my bag, more tools, techniques, questions, curiosities, models, theories, foundations, then I can probably be a lot more versatile in the moment with a client. I'll refer a lot less, so that client doesn't have to build another relationship with another coach who's got an approach that works for them. And also my work is going to stay a lot more interesting because, I don't have a particular kind of client or a particular niche or a particular psychograph. There's not a particular kind of person that comes to my coaching specifically. I can work with so many very different people. And that for me was very important, very valuable. Much more of a range of approaches that I can work. So more interesting for me, more helpful for the clients, and a lot more complex in terms of how do we now navigate that. So, if you're in the beginning of your coaching journey, stick with one approach, stick with that framework. That's good. Learn that, become masterful at it, and then you can branch out and look around. But also, if you're a new coach, it's good to look around first and see what else is out there. And then you can jump into depth into something that you hadn't known existed or was allowed.
Yeah. I love that last point. And I think that's really the value of the coaching lab is like, I went through the website and looked at the different people you've brought in. And, there's so much variety there. And I think it's great because you get exposed to different ways of coaching. I know there's someone that was there that coaches primarily around thought, and there's a big movement around like the 3 principles coaching, right? And I think it's really interesting to get to see like, well, what's going on, right? Because there are people they love, for example, neuroscience of coaching, and for them that's it. It's their thing, right? It's like it's great magic, and there are people like that in the positive psychology world, and I think it's actually great to get exposed to that at different times of your journey, and it can, I think it opens up. It can open up a lot of growth.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, that's a lot of that. And
it will take discipline, right? And it takes discipline to just say, well, you know what? Okay. And I think that's the great thing about the coaching lab is like it exposes you to a lot of these things, but at the same time, we have to be mindful as coaches, right? Like it's very easy to fall into the what do you call it? Shiny object syndrome.
Yeah, shiny new CPD, new certificate. We had a coach on the lab that in the background he had like, I don't know, just in the background of what you could see, there were like 30 different diplomas and certificates. And he was saying, Dr. D. Van Young, it was amazing, charismatic guy. But he said like, oh yeah, my whole house is full of that. There's just a lot that he's gathered. And he's a masterful coach. That was like probably the cleanest MCC session that I've seen. It was amazing. But like, yeah, he gathered so many things. But yeah, I'm so excited about going forward at some point, branching out and really doing like depth labs, where it's a specific framework or a specific approach. I need to get a bit more numbers, right? So because it needs to be viable and you need to have a good group that is committed to really go into depth on something, and that there won't be drop-in sessions, there will be, okay, commit to go into depth on something for a year, and then we really pick an approach, positive psychology coaching lab, whatever. So there's many arms, and I'm excited about like right now, there's a lot of breadth, and people seem to really enjoy that. But I'm really looking forward to really going into depth on existential coaching, for example. What are different styles of existential coaching, and how might I get into that and deepen it? So yeah, that's exciting. I wonder if there's more, or we've been going on for about 40 minutes. I'm happy to maybe leave this there, close it officially as an episode, but maybe just stay on and see if we've got any more comments from the crowd. How do you feel, Siavash? Is there anything else you want to say?
Well, I think my invitation would be, for people to come and experience the coaching lab, because we can talk about it, and it's not going to be the same as actually experiencing it. I think, you just uncover a lot of different things. It's great to just practice a lot, but then if you're observing someone else's coaching, there's a different learning that opens up. And then, if you're part of this community, maybe at some point you can step forward and say, hey, I would like to be the coach, or I would like to be the client. And again, it opens up a different world of knowledge and learning. And so my invitation would be really for people to come and join this. And I don't know what you had in mind, but we have probably a lot of listeners that come in on a regular basis. Maybe we can have like a special offer, a coupon code for them. But that's what I would really like, is for people to come and experience it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because one thing I'm going to set up a coupon code. I should have probably come prepared for that, but I'm going to set up a coupon code, TAC, as in talking about coaching, and I'm going to give you 30% off. So that's there. If you're listening to this, you want to check it out, go to gocoachinglab.com and at checkout, if you use coupon code TAC, that'll give you a juicy discount. And also, you mentioned something that I forgot to mention, right? Because the coaching lab, the recordings that we have, and there's 36 of them now. They're the 45-minute coaching session, and then about 45 minutes of reflections, Q&A, conversations with the group, with the coach and the client. But then there's a third part we obviously don't record, which is just experimental breakouts. Some people just continue the conversation about the lab, but it's an invitation to really practice, try something out, experiment, play around with a new technique, a new way of being. Really connect, it to practice. If you got inspired by something, I mean, I used one of those spaces just to play around with some IFS techniques, parts work. That was like, it opened something up so quickly. It was incredible. And when else do you have spaces to play around with that, especially after you're out of training? You're not going to necessarily play around with paying clients with something you've just learned. You just want to play with. So it's really a nice playground afterwards in a safe environment, or a brave environment, with some people who also want to play. And they're also coaches. Get some feedback on your coaching. Maybe just get some free coaching. I always thought it'd be so valuable for somebody who's not a coach, but who might want to get a coach, but there's just so many people out there, just to get a sense for what different people and different approaches are like. Understand coaching a bit more before you hire one. And maybe you get inspired by a particular coach and you're like, oh, I actually would like to work with this guy. If you want to know what coaching with Siavash is like, or what it can be like, come in. He's coached me a couple of months ago. And that was super interesting, but you get a sense for what somebody coaches like. So yeah, I think I shut up about it now, because otherwise I'll talk for ages. I think I've said everything I needed to say. Thanks so much, Siavash. I didn't ask you to help me promote this. We just wanted to talk about this. I know you like the concept. You're not profiting from this. I'm not profiting from this at the moment. We'd love to grow the community a little bit more so that, it can actually turn a profit, and then we can reinvest it in running more labs and inviting some like consistently super high profile people. I would love that. So yeah, I'm excited about where this can go. And Siavash, thank you so much for helping me spread the word.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for being with us today. I appreciate your commitment to learning and growing as a coach. Just a few things before you go. First of all, we're doing this for you. So if there's anything you'd like us to talk about, do send us a question. Secondly, we're not doing this for profit, so we rely on your support to help us reach as many coaches as we can. So if you can send this episode to a friend, or tell a fellow coach about what we're doing here, maybe you can subscribe or leave us a review, or even support us on Patreon. That would be amazing. And lastly, you can find us across all major platforms. So whether you like to watch, or you like to listen, or you like to download episodes and listen to it in your car while you're driving through somewhere with no internet, you can do so too. And that's it from us. Thank you, and I hope to see you next time.